All right, let's just gently drift back in. No sudden movements, same jungle, same humidity, same uncomfortable sandals made of woven fiber that absolutely did not support the arch. Now that we've floated through the broad collapse, the climate stress, the overcrowding, the political gridlock, it's time to zoom in a little. Because civilizations don't collapse, people do. Slowly, tiredly, while insisting everything is fine. And nowhere is that more visible than in the personal lives of Maya kings. Maya rulers didn't call themselves king in the casual way. They were Kulhul Ahau, holy lords, sacred intermediaries between humans and the cosmos, which means if crops failed, it wasn't just a policy failure, it was a spiritual embarrassment. From birth, royal children were groomed for this role. Their skulls were intentionally shaped, their teeth inlaid with jade, their identities carved into stone before they could form sentences. Nothing says healthy childhood like knowing your job is to keep the universe functioning. These kings lived surrounded by ceremony. Bloodletting rituals weren't optional, they were routine. Tongues pierced, genitals pierced, blood dripped onto bark paper and burned so the smoke could carry prayers upward. Very relaxing, very sustainable. And for centuries, it worked. Or at least, it seemed to. But by the late Classic period, something changes in the inscriptions. Earlier monuments are confident. They celebrate accessions, victories, cosmic anniversaries. Later ones feel strained. Kings start emphasizing lineage more aggressively. They name-drop ancestors constantly, which is usually a sign that people are asking, why should we listen to you? Some rulers even resurrect long-dead dynastic founders in their inscriptions, symbolically reenacting their authority, which is basically ancient political cosplay. Take Tikal, for example. Tikal was one of the most powerful Maya cities. Huge population, strategic location, impressive monuments. But even Tikal struggled. In the late 8th century, Tikal's rulers were building faster, taller, more elaborate structures, while the population below them was thinning out. You can feel the anxiety in the stone. Stelae show kings performing increasingly intense rituals. Bloodletting scenes get more dramatic, costumes more elaborate. It's as if the kings are saying, look how hard I'm trying, surely the gods will notice. Meanwhile, the rain still isn't coming. Another city, Capan, tells an even quieter tragedy. Capan was located in modern Honduras and had a well-documented dynastic history. We know the names of its kings, their birth dates, their accessions. And then, the last king, ruler 16. He accedes to the throne in 822 CE, and that's it. No monuments after that. No grand finales, just silence. Capan didn't fall in flames, it just stopped investing in kingship. People left the core city, elite compounds were abandoned. The divine ruler simply ceased to matter. Which, honestly, is the worst possible ending for someone who believed the universe revolved around them. This pattern repeats across the southern lowlands. Kings ruling over shrinking populations, cities still performing rituals for increasingly empty plazas. And it's important to notice something subtle here. There's no evidence of massive revolts, no burned palaces, no beheaded rulers displayed dramatically. The people didn't overthrow the kings. They walked away. They disengaged. They stopped showing up, which is devastating in its own quiet way. Without labor, monuments can't be built. Without audiences, rituals lose meaning. Without belief, divine kingship collapses under its own weight. And the kings, well, they kept doing what they knew. They commissioned more stelae. They emphasized sacred calendars. They doubled down on tradition. Because when your entire worldview says the problem is spiritual imbalance, you don't invent a new system. You bleed harder. Now let's gently float over to the calendar for a moment. The Maya were obsessed with time, not casually interested, obsessed. They tracked multiple calendars simultaneously, the Tzalkin, the Hab, the long count. They believed time was cyclical, that events repeated, that the cosmos moved in predictable rhythms, which is comforting until things stop lining up. During the collapse period, inscriptions increasingly focus on anniversaries of past events rather than future projections, which suggests something interesting. The future had become uncertain, and uncertainty is not great for a civilization built on cosmic order. Some scholars suggest that droughts disrupted ritual calendars. Ceremonies tied to rain cycles failed repeatedly. Imagine being a king whose entire legitimacy rests on performing the correct ritual at the correct cosmic moment, and it keeps not working. That's an existential crisis carved in limestone. Now let's talk about food. Maize was the backbone of Maya life. Corn wasn't just food, it was identity. The Maya believed humans were literally made from maize. So when maize failed, that wasn't just hunger, that was a cosmic error. Overfarming had degraded soil, deforestation reduced water retention, drought finished the job, and elite demands didn't slow down. Palaces still needed servants, ceremonies still needed offerings, kings still expected tribute, which means commoners bore the cost, and commoners left. They didn't write inscriptions, they didn't leave dramatic records, they simply relocated. Smaller communities, more sustainable farming, less obsession with feeding gods who weren't delivering. The Maya world didn't collapse evenly. Northern regions adapted better. Trade routes shifted toward coastal and riverine networks. Places like Chichen Itza would later thrive using different political models, less focused on divine kingship, more on councils and shared authority. Which suggests something important. The problem wasn't the Maya people, it was the classic Maya system. Specifically, a system that tied political legitimacy to cosmic performance in a changing environment. And once that environment changed too much, the system broke. The kings were trapped by their own ideology. They couldn't say, the gods are wrong. They couldn't say, we need a new model. All they could do was perform the same rituals louder, longer, and more elaborately, until there was no one else watching. And that is the quiet tragedy of divine rulership. No dramatic erection, just irrelevance. As we drift forward in time, past empty thrones and eroded glyphs, it becomes clear that the Maya collapse wasn't about failure. It was about transition, the end of one way of organizing power, the end of kings who claimed to hold the sky together with blood and calendars. In the next part, we'll wander into the landscape itself, the forests, the reservoirs, the subtle environmental feedback loops that made recovery harder each year. Nothing loud, nothing scary, just the slow conversation between humans and the land, where the land eventually stops responding. So for now, rest your eyes. The monuments are quiet, the kings are gone, and the jungle is very... All right, welcome back. Same slow pace, same warm night air, same sense that nothing is urgent anymore. Let's stop looking at kings for a moment. They've had plenty of attention. Too much, honestly. Instead, let's look down, at the ground, at the soil, at the forests that quietly watched this whole thing happen and never once wrote a monument about it. Because if the Maya collapse had a main character that never got enough credit, it was the environment. The Maya lowlands are tropical, green, dense, visually generous, but agriculturally kind of rude. The soil is thin and nutrient poor. Most of the fertility comes from organic matter sitting right on top, leaves, plants, decaying forest life. Once you clear the forest, that fertility disappears quickly. The Maya knew this. They weren't careless. They practiced slash-and-burn agriculture, which works if you give the land time to recover. They built terraces on hillsides, raised fields and wetlands, complex reservoir systems to capture rainwater. In many ways, they were ahead of their time. But none of those systems were designed for endless population growth combined with elite overconsumption. And that's where things start to gently unravel. By the late Classic period, forests around major cities were heavily cleared. Wood was needed for cooking, construction, lime plaster. Lime plaster deserves a quick, sleepy mention. Maya cities were coated in it. Temples, plazas, buildings, all gleaming white when new. But making lime plaster requires burning limestone at very high temperatures, which requires a lot of wood. Like, a lot. So every new monument didn't just symbolize power, it quietly removed another chunk of forest. Deforestation had consequences. Without trees, soil eroded faster, rainwater ran off instead of soaking in, reservoirs filled with sediment, which meant less usable water during a period of increasing drought. Very inconvenient timing. And the droughts were real. Modern climate studies using lake sediments and cave formations show repeated dry periods between roughly 750 and 900 CE. Not constant dryness, but frequent enough to break systems that depended on predictability. Rain came late, or not at all, or came all at once and washed away topsoil. Maize doesn't love that. And maize was everything. The Maya didn't diversify crops as much as some other societies. Beans and squash helped, sure, but maize was central. Culturally, spiritually, economically. So when maize yields dropped, everything dropped. Food shortages lead to malnutrition. Malnutrition leads to disease. Disease lowers labor capacity, which makes it harder to maintain terraces, reservoirs, and fields, which leads to more crop failure. A very calm, very boring, very deadly feedback loop. What's fascinating is that the Maya kept building reservoirs even late into the collapse. They tried. They expanded water systems, deepened storage, improved channels. But again, scale. These systems were designed to support cities at their peak population. Once labor declined, maintenance became impossible. Reservoir walls cracked, channels clogged, water quality deteriorated, and stagnant water in the tropics is not your friend. Meanwhile, as forests receded, local climates changed. Trees help regulate temperature and moisture. Without them, areas became hotter and drier. So human activity didn't just respond to drought, it amplified it, which is awkward. The Maya weren't intentionally destroying their environment. They were doing what worked until it didn't. And once it stopped working, the fixes required coordination, restraint, and political flexibility. Which brings us back, very gently, to elites. Because environmental stress hits everyone, but elites decide how society responds. And the classic Maya elites responded by maintaining tradition. They didn't radically restructure agriculture. They didn't redistribute population deliberately. They kept building monuments, kept hosting ceremonies, kept demanding tribute, which meant environmental stress became social stress, and social stress leaks. Archaeologists see signs of nutritional decline in skeletons, shorter stature, more stress markers. They see simpler housing, less investment in elite goods. They see cities shrinking inward, abandoning outer neighborhoods first, which tells us something important. People weren't waiting for permission to leave. They left when staying stopped making sense. This wasn't panic, it was pragmatism. Families moved closer to water sources, to better land, to smaller communities where social obligations were manageable. Because supporting a divine king is only appealing when he's actually helping, and if the land isn't responding, neither do people. Let's talk briefly about trade. The Maya were deeply interconnected. They traded obsidian, jade, cacao, salts, feathers. Trade routes linked cities across vast distances, but trade depends on stability. When cities weakened, routes broke down. When warfare increased, travel became risky. And when drought hit, surplus disappeared. So cities that relied on imported food or prestige goods lost access, which further weakened elites. Because if you can't provide luxury, you lose status. And Maya elites loved status. At some point, the cost of maintaining urban life exceeded its benefits, and that's when decentralization happens. Not collapse in the cinematic sense, just rebalancing. Smaller settlements became the norm, political authority fragmented, religious practices shifted away from centralized kingship, and the jungle moved back in. Trees reclaimed plazas, roots cracked stone, not violently, patiently. The environment didn't destroy the Maya, it just waited them out. And that's the part that feels very sleepy and inevitable, because nature doesn't rush. It doesn't announce. It just slowly changes the terms until adaptation becomes mandatory. By the time Spanish explorers arrived centuries later, they found ruins already ancient, cities swallowed by forest, stelae eroded. They assumed mystery, disappearance, lost civilizations. But the truth was quieter. The Maya adapted, just not in the way stone monuments could record. Their descendants lived on in villages, towns, new political systems. The collapse wasn't an end. It was a shedding of excess. Too many kings, too many monuments, too much strain. In the next part, we'll drift forward into the post-collapse Maya world, what survived, what changed, and how later Maya societies learned, slowly, to live without divine kings insisting they personally controlled the rain. For now, let the forest breathe. The fields are quiet, the reservoirs are still, and the land has finally had the... All right, ease back in. Same low volume, same unhurried thoughts. Same sense that time is more of a suggestion than a rule. By now, the big stone cities of the southern lowlands are quiet. The plazas are empty. The stelae have stopped updating their calendars. The divine kings have either faded into obscurity or are still performing rituals for audiences that no longer exist. But here's the important, very undramatic thing. The Maya didn't go anywhere. They didn't vanish. They didn't forget how to farm. They didn't collectively walk into the jungle never to be seen again. They simply changed their lifestyle, which, historically speaking, is the least exciting explanation and therefore the correct one. After the classic collapse, Maya society shifted northward and outward, away from massive inland capitals, toward regions with better access to water, trade, and flexible resources. The northern Yucatan Peninsula becomes more important now. Less rainfall overall, yes, but more predictable access to cenotes, natural sinkholes filled with groundwater. And groundwater, unlike divine kings, tends to show up consistently. Cities like Chichen Itza rise during this period. Now, Chichen Itza is often treated like it magically appeared after the collapse, fully formed and mysterious. It didn't. It grew slowly, absorbing influences from multiple regions, including central Mexico. And most importantly, it did things differently. Chichen Itza doesn't revolve around a single, all-powerful divine king. Instead, Power appears more shared, more council-based, more militarized, yes, but less dependent on one man's cosmic performance, which is a fascinating pivot, because it suggests the Maya learned something. They didn't abandon religion, they didn't stop ritual, but they loosened the idea that one ruler's blood alone kept the universe functioning, which is healthy. Architecture changes too. Less obsession with individual lineage, more emphasis on communal spaces, ball courts, market areas. Trade becomes even more central. Salt from the coasts, cacao, obsidian, cotton. These later Maya cities were less inward-looking and more connected, and that connectivity mattered, because flexibility matters. Meanwhile, in the southern lowlands, people didn't just leave and never look back. They returned occasionally. They reused old buildings. They farmed near ancient ruins. The cities weren't cursed, they were just impractical at their former scale. And there's something quietly comforting about that. The collapse didn't erase memory, it recontextualized it. The old monuments became reminders, not warnings carved in stone, but background. A civilization learning to live smaller. Let's pause for a moment on religion, because one of the biggest misconceptions about the Maya collapse is that people lost faith. They didn't. They just changed how faith was organized. Ritual continued, calendars continued, ceremonies continued. But the idea of the king as a living god weakened. Priests became more important than rulers. Local rituals mattered more than centralized ceremonies, which is exactly what you'd expect when large political systems fragment. Belief adapts faster than institutions. And that's why Maya culture endured. Language, mythology, agricultural knowledge. None of that required a king on a pyramid bleeding into bark paper. It required community. And community proved more durable than monuments. By the time the post-classic period is in full swing, Maya society looks different, but familiar. Smaller cities, more trade, more regional variation, less emphasis on recording every royal birthday in stone, which, honestly, probably saved a lot of time. And this is where the story gets quietly ironic, because centuries later, when the Spanish arrive, they encounter Maya societies that are resilient, adaptive, and deeply rooted, not fragile remnants of a fallen golden age, but functioning communities. The Spanish chroniclers saw ruins and assumed decline. What they didn't see was continuity, because continuity doesn't shout, it whispers. And now, very gently, let's talk about why the collapse story keeps getting misunderstood. Part of it is aesthetics. Big ruins feel final, empty cities feel dramatic, and humans love drama. But archaeology keeps reminding us that abandonment doesn't equal failure. Sometimes it equals wisdom. The Maya abandoned what no longer worked. They kept what did, which is more than many civilizations manage. As we drift toward the end of this section, it's worth noting that the classic Maya collapse wasn't universal. Some cities lingered longer, some adapted better. There was no single timeline, which makes it less cinematic, but more real. History rarely collapses in sync. It frays, and the Maya frayed gracefully. In the next part, we'll gently revisit some of the old myths, the mysterious disappearance, the lost knowledge, the idea that the jungle swallowed everything overnight. We'll untangle those assumptions, slowly, without startling anyone. So for now, rest. The kings are gone, the people remain, and the story is... All right. Settle back in. Nothing sudden, nothing sharp. At this point in the story, the classic Maya kings are gone, the big southern cities are quiet, and the jungle has politely reclaimed the real estate. And this is usually where popular history does something a little dramatic. This is where someone says in a hushed voice, "They disappeared." Which, no, they absolutely did not. But that idea stuck hard because humans love a mystery more than they love accuracy, and the Maya collapse looks mysterious if you only glance at it and then immediately stop thinking. Early European explorers came across massive ruins buried in forest, no obvious written explanation, no grand plaque saying, "We downsized due to environmental stress and elite inflexibility." So they filled in the blanks. Lost civilization, sudden collapse, unknown catastrophe. Because that sounds cooler than people moved to smaller communities and adjusted their farming strategies. The ruins themselves encouraged this thinking. They're dramatic, overgrown, silent, and silence makes people uncomfortable. So they invented stories. Some suggested disease wiped everyone out. Others blamed invasion. Still others leaned into mystical nonsense about cosmic cycles ending civilization overnight. Which is ironic because the Maya actually did track cosmic cycles. They just didn't use them to predict their own extinction. One of the biggest misunderstandings centers around Maya writing. For a long time, scholars couldn't read the glyphs, so they assumed the inscriptions were mostly religious or astronomical. Once decipherment improved in the 20th century, a funny thing happened. The texts turned out to be very human. They talk about births, deaths, marriages, wars, political alliances, not doomsday prophecies, just elites doing elite things. And what they don't talk about is collapse, because people living through slow decline rarely announce it. They don't say, "This is the beginning of the end." They say, "This year was difficult, but next year will be better." Every time. Another myth is that knowledge was lost. Astronomy, mathematics, calendars. But again, no. Those systems continued. The Maya calendar didn't end, it just rolled over, which caused a completely unnecessary panic in 2012, but that's a whole other nap. Maya farmers continued using agricultural knowledge passed down for generations. Languages persisted, still do. If knowledge had truly been lost, you wouldn't see continuity. But you do, everywhere. The real loss wasn't intellectual, it was architectural. When cities emptied, stone stopped being the primary medium of memory. People stopped carving everything into monuments, and history that isn't carved in stone tends to be ignored, which says more about historians than about the Maya. The idea of disappearance also ignores something deeply important. The Maya collapse wasn't experienced as a single moment. For someone living in 850 CE, life probably felt harder, more unpredictable, but not apocalyptic. Children were still born, fields were still planted, rituals were still performed. There was no moment when someone said, "Well, civilization's over, let's wrap it up." Instead, there were thousands of tiny decisions. This field isn't producing anymore. Let's move closer to water. The city is demanding more tribute. Let's leave. The king's rituals aren't helping. Let's listen less. Collapse is often just the accumulation of quiet exits, and that doesn't leave behind dramatic stories. It leaves behind absence, which later generations interpret as mystery. Let's also talk briefly about violence. Another popular idea is that warfare destroyed the Maya. There was warfare, plenty of it, but it wasn't uniquely destructive compared to earlier periods. In fact, many of the worst wars happened during times of stress, not as the cause of collapse. War was a symptom, a way for elites to assert control when resources were shrinking. And when war fails to restore stability, people disengage. They don't fight harder, they leave, which is exactly what happened. One of the strangest myths is that the jungle itself killed the Maya, as if trees rose up one night and said, "This is our city now." In reality, the jungle returning was a result of abandonment, not the cause. Plants don't attack civilizations, they wait, and that patience gets mistaken for aggression. Now here's something quietly interesting. Modern Maya communities often live near ancient ruins. They know them, they have names for them. They don't see them as mysterious lost cities. They see them as places where ancestors lived and eventually moved on from, which is such a grounded perspective that it almost ruins the romance. And that's probably why it doesn't get enough attention, because romance prefers extinction. Reality prefers adaptation. As we drift further into this part of the story, it becomes clear that the Maya collapse wasn't an anomaly. It fits a pattern. Complex societies grow, they centralize power, they stress resources, they struggle to adapt. Then they fragment. Not because people fail, but because systems do. And when systems become too rigid, they crack. The Maya story feels dramatic because the material culture was so monumental. Stone doesn't decay quietly, it lingers, and ruins invite projection. But behind those stones were people who made reasonable choices given their circumstances. They weren't doomed, they were pragmatic. In the next part, we'll gently step back and look at the Maya collapse in comparison to other civilizations, not to rank them, not to dramatize, just to notice how familiar this pattern is, how often humans build systems that work beautifully until they don't. So for now, let the myths rest. The Maya didn't disappear, they simply stopped living in ways that no longer made sense. And honestly, that's not a mystery. That's just being. All right, we're back. Same slow rhythm, same sense that nothing here needs your full attention. Now that we've gently cleared away the myths, the sudden disappearance, the mystical doom, the jungle ambush, it's time to do something very unexciting. We're going to compare. Because nothing makes a historical collapse feel less mysterious than realizing it's part of a very long, very repetitive pattern. The Maya were not special in their collapse. They were just particularly good at leaving behind impressive ruins. If stone monuments were social media posts, the Maya were extremely online. Let's start with a simple idea. Complex societies don't usually fall apart because of one big thing. They fall apart because of layers: environmental stress, political rigidity, elite overreach, economic imbalance. Add those together, give it a few generations, and you get fragmentation. Not explosion, not apocalypse, just thinning. We've seen this before. Ancient Mesopotamia, salinized soil from over-irrigation, crop yields dropped, cities shrank. The Roman Empire, economic strain, administrative overload, climate fluctuations, too much territory, not enough adaptability. The Indus Valley civilization, shifting rivers, trade disruptions, urban centers quietly abandoned. Notice a theme? Nobody wakes up one morning and says, "Today we collapse." They wake up and say, "Things are harder than they used to be," and then they adjust. The Maya did exactly that. They didn't cling to dying cities out of stubbornness. They didn't sacrifice themselves for monuments. They left, which is probably the most rational response available. One of the reasons the Maya collapse feels so eerie is because the transition didn't involve conquest. There's no invading army to blame, no external villain, just internal limits. And that makes people uncomfortable because it suggests collapse doesn't need an enemy. It just needs momentum. Let's talk about elites again, very gently. Because elites are often the least adaptable part of any system. The classic Maya elite class was deeply invested in divine kingship, monumental architecture, and ritual performance. Those things required surplus. Surplus depends on stability. When stability wobbles, elites tend to protect their position rather than rethink it, which means they demand more tribute at the exact wrong time. And this creates a disconnect. Elites double down, commoners disengage, and suddenly the system loses its base. This isn't unique to the Maya. It's almost boringly common. What makes the Maya case interesting is how clearly we can see the timeline. The inscriptions fade, construction slows, urban areas shrink. The archaeological record doesn't show chaos, it shows withdrawal. And withdrawal is a form of agency, people choosing sustainability over spectacle. Now, let's address a subtle but important point. The Maya collapse didn't eliminate hierarchy, it reshaped it. Later Maya societies still had leaders, still had nobles, still had conflict, but power was less centralized, less cosmic, less dependent on one person's ritual success, which made it more resilient. Smaller systems can bend. Large, rigid systems tend to snap. And this is where the Maya story stops being ancient and starts feeling modern. Because the lesson isn't don't build cities, it's don't make your entire political system dependent on conditions you can't control. Rainfall, climate, cosmic favor. Those are risky foundations, and when they shift, ideology needs to shift too. The Maya kings couldn't do that. The people could. So they did. One of the quiet strengths of Maya society was its flexibility at the community level. Agricultural knowledge adapted, settlement patterns changed, trade routes evolved. Culture persisted because it wasn't locked into stone, which is ironic considering how much stone they carved. The monuments didn't save the system. The people did, by letting it go. As we drift toward the end of this part, it's worth thinking about why we keep calling this a collapse at all. Because collapse implies failure, and failure implies something went wrong. But what if this was just a phase transition? What if the classic Maya system did exactly what systems do? Expanded, peaked, and then reorganized into something smaller and more flexible. That doesn't feel like failure. That feels like adaptation. The tragedy, if there is one, belongs mostly to the elites. They invested everything in permanence, and permanence is fragile. The common people invested in survival, and survival tends to work out better. In the next part, we'll slow things down even more and zoom in on daily life for ordinary Maya families. Not the kings, not the priests, just people planting maize, raising children, and deciding whether it was time to move. Nothing dramatic, just choices. So for now, rest. History isn't rushing. It never does. And the Maya story continues, quietly, through the people who never stopped. All right, welcome back. Same slow breathing, same sense that nothing terrible is about to happen. Because here's the thing that rarely gets said out loud. Collapse, when you're living inside it, does not feel dramatic. It feels inconvenient. It feels like more walking, more waiting, more uncertainty about next season. So let's gently step away from kings and monuments for a while. They've had enough attention. Let's sit with an ordinary Maya family somewhere around the late 800s. No stone inscriptions, no elaborate headdresses, just people. They live on the edge of a once large city, or what used to be the edge before the city shrank inward. Their house is modest: wattle and daub walls, thatched roof, a cooking hearth. They grow maize, beans, squash. Their calendar still matters. Ritual still matters. But things are harder. The rains are less predictable. Sometimes they come late, sometimes too hard. The fields don't produce what they used to, and the city, the big ceremonial center, keeps asking for tribute: food, labor, time, which is frustrating when you're already stretched thin. This family has heard stories about the old days, when ceremonies worked, when the king's rituals brought rain. But lately, nothing seems to line up. The ceremonies are still happening, but fewer people attend, because attending means not tending fields, and fields are starting to matter more than pageantry. So people make choices. Maybe they skip a ceremony, just this once. Nothing bad happens. The world doesn't end. And that realization, quiet, unspoken, is powerful. Because once you realize that the gods don't immediately punish disengagement, authority weakens. Not violently, subtly. The family hears about others moving, closer to a cenote, closer to better soil. Not far, just elsewhere. At first, they don't go. Leaving is risky. Change is scary. But then another bad harvest hits, and then another, and the tribute demands don't stop. So they talk, quietly, at night, and eventually they decide. They don't announce it, they don't rebel, they just pack up what they can carry and leave. And when they do, the city doesn't chase them. It can't. Too many others are doing the same. This is how urban centers empty, not with screams, with footsteps, one household at a time. Now multiply that by hundreds, then thousands, and suddenly the city is still standing, but hollow, and hollow structures don't last. What's important here is that for most people, life doesn't feel like it's ending. It feels like it's suggesting. Children are still born, meals are still cooked, stories are still told. The big difference is where life happens. Less in ceremonial centers, more in dispersed communities. And those communities are often better positioned to survive environmental stress. Smaller populations, closer ties, less tribute, less obligation to feed someone else's ideology. This is why the Maya collapse didn't produce mass graves or layers of destruction. People left before things got catastrophic, which means suffering was real, but mitigated. That's not failure. That's foresight. Let's talk briefly about health. Skeletons from the late classic period show signs of stress, malnutrition, illness, but not sudden mass death. It's gradual, a little shorter stature, more wear on bones, which tells us people were working harder, carrying water farther, clearing new fields. Life became more labor-intensive, but not unlivable. And when life became too hard in one place, people moved. The environment wasn't uniform. Some areas fared better than others, and Maya families were smart enough to notice. This is one of the advantages of not being locked into a rigid caste system. You can leave. The Maya were tied to land, yes, but not to cities, and that flexibility mattered. Let's gently address another assumption, that people were loyal to kings out of blind faith. They weren't. They participated because it worked. When it stopped working, they stopped participating, which is a very rational approach to religion and politics. The Maya didn't suddenly stop believing. They just stopped believing that this particular arrangement was effective. and belief systems can handle that. Institutions struggle. This is why post-collapse Maya religion looks different, more localized, more household-focused, less spectacle, more practicality, which is exactly what you'd expect from people living closer to subsistence. Now, imagine being a child during this period. You don't experience collapse. You experience relocation. Your parents talk about moving. You help carry things. You grow up somewhere new. The old city becomes a story, a place adults talk about, a place with big buildings that nobody uses anymore. And eventually it becomes background, which is how ruins are born. Not from tragedy, from memory. As we drift toward the end of this part, it becomes clear that the Maya collapse wasn't a single shared experience. It depended on where you lived, who you were, what resources you had. For elites, it was devastating. Loss of power, loss of meaning. For common people, it was change. Hard, stressful, but survivable. And survival is a quiet victory. In the next part, we'll float back up again, not to kings, but to ideas. What did the Maya collapse teach later societies, including us, even if we don't always like the answer? Nothing urgent, nothing alarming, just patterns. So for now, rest. The cooking fire is low, the night insects are loud, and tomorrow, there's... All right, settle back in again. Same gentle pace, same understanding that nothing here is demanding your attention all at once. By now, the Maya collapse doesn't feel mysterious anymore. It feels familiar, which is usually the point where people get a little uncomfortable. Because once you strip away the jungle vines and carved glyphs, what's left is a pattern humans repeat with impressive consistency. Build complexity, centralize power, tie legitimacy to things that are hard to control. Ignore warning signs, then act surprised when the system becomes brittle. The Maya weren't foolish. They weren't reckless. They were successful for centuries. And that success created habits. Habits are comforting. They're also dangerous. When something works for a long time, it starts to feel permanent. It starts to feel natural. Divine kingship wasn't just politics, it was reality. So when reality shifted, climate variability, population pressure, the system didn't adapt quickly enough. Because adapting meant questioning fundamentals, and societies are very bad at that. The Maya collapse teaches us something quietly important. Environmental stress doesn't destroy civilizations by itself. It exposes weaknesses. Drought didn't end the classic Maya world. It revealed how dependent that world was on stability. And once that dependency was exposed, everything else followed. Another uncomfortable pattern is elite insulation. Maya kings lived well even as conditions worsened. Palaces remained stocked, ceremonies continued, which delayed meaningful reform. Because when leaders don't feel the consequences immediately, they underestimate them. By the time elites feel pressure, the system is already fraying. And again, this isn't unique. It's practically universal. Now, let's talk about belief systems. The Maya worldview was elegant, complex, beautiful, but it was also rigid. Time was cyclical. Ritual maintained order. Kings mediated between worlds. That framework worked beautifully until it didn't. And when it stopped working, it offered limited tools for reimagining authority. Belief systems can adapt, but institutions tied tightly to belief often can't. So belief survives. Institutions don't. This is why Maya religion persisted even as Maya kingship faded. Ideas are flexible, hierarchies are not. Another pattern people don't like to admit is that collapse often improves things, eventually. Not immediately, not painlessly, but in the long run, smaller, more flexible systems tend to be more sustainable. Post-classic Maya societies weren't weaker, they were different. Less monuments-focused, less centralized, more adaptable. Which suggests that collapse wasn't an ending, it was a correction. The Maya world overshot its sustainable limits. Then it recalibrated, slowly, unevenly. Human history is full of these recalibrations. We just don't like calling them that, because recalibration doesn't sound epic, it sounds technical, and humans prefer epics. One of the strangest things about the Maya collapse is how little panic it produced. No apocalypse myths carved in stone, no mass abandonment at once, just decades of adjustment. That tells us something about human psychology. People normalize stress, they adapt incrementally. And because of that, collapse rarely feels like collapse while it's happening. It feels like a bad decade, then another, then a new normal, which is both reassuring and slightly unsettling. Now, let's gently step back and look at time. The Maya thought in long cycles. They tracked time on scales most societies didn't bother with. Thousands of years, baktans, great cycles. And yet, their political system was fragile on a much shorter timescale. Which is ironic. They could imagine deep time, but they couldn't imagine a world without divine kings. That's not a failure of intelligence, it's a failure of imagination constrained by success. And success always narrows imagination. Because why imagine alternatives when the current system works? Until it doesn't. This is why the Maya collapse continues to matter. Not because it's mysterious, but because it's ordinary. It's a mirror. And mirrors make people uneasy. As we drift toward the end of this part, it's worth sitting with a very calm thought. Civilizations don't die, they transform. What dies are specific arrangements of power, belief, and resource use. And those arrangements are never permanent. Stone can make them feel permanent, calendars can make them feel eternal, but they're not, and they never have been. The Maya collapse wasn't a warning carved in stone for future civilizations. It was a quiet lesson written in soil, water, and movement. People adapted. They always do. The question is how much strain adaptation requires. In the next part, we'll gently circle back to the beginning, not to restart the story, but to see it whole, from rise to peak to quiet transformation. No drama, no cliffhanger, just a long view. So for now, rest. Time is slow, and history is patient, and patterns keep. All right, welcome back. Nothing new to learn right away, just the same story, seen from a little higher up. We've spent a lot of time inside the collapse, inside the droughts, inside the emptying cities. So now let's gently rewind. Not all the way to the beginning, just enough to see the arc. Because the Maya collapse only makes sense when you remember how successful the Maya were for a very long time. The rise of the classic Maya wasn't inevitable. It was the result of smart decisions layered over generations. They mastered agriculture in a difficult environment. They built water systems without metal tools. They developed writing, astronomy, mathematics. They didn't stumble into complexity. They earned it. And that success allowed cities to grow. Cities allowed specialization. Specialization allowed elites. Elites allowed ideology. And ideology, once it's carved into stone, starts to feel like truth. At their peak, Maya cities were impressive not just physically, but organizationally, coordinating labor, managing food distribution, scheduling rituals tied to cosmic cycles. This wasn't chaos, it was order, very specific order. And the problem with very specific order is that it assumes stability. It assumes rainfall stays within expected patterns. It assumes population growth stays manageable. It assumes political rivals don't escalate conflict endlessly. Those assumptions worked until they didn't. What's important here is that the same strengths that built Maya civilization later constrained it. Monumental architecture required constant labor and resources. Divine kingship required constant performance. Ritual calendars required predictability. When unpredictability increased, those strengths became liabilities. And systems don't usually recognize when their strengths turn into weaknesses. They just keep using them. The Maya kings didn't invent bad policies. They followed tradition, which is comforting and dangerous. As cities grew larger, the margin for error shrank. Small droughts that once caused inconvenience now caused crisis. Minor wars that once felt manageable now disrupted entire regions. And instead of simplifying, the system added complexity, more rituals, more monuments, more obligations, because complexity feels like control, until it isn't. Now here's something that often gets overlooked. The Maya didn't stop building overnight. Building slowed gradually. Monuments got smaller, dates got farther apart. That gap between inscriptions, that silence, is one of the most honest records we have, because silence usually means resources were going elsewhere, not into stone, into survival. When people stop investing in monuments, they aren't giving up, they're reprioritizing. And that shift from monument to meal is where collapse lives, not in disaster, in choice. Over time, paths replaced roads, trails replaced plazas, movement became quieter, more local, less centralized. And that's why the jungle didn't need to conquer anything. It just filled space no longer defended by daily human activity. Plants don't care about political systems. They respond to absence, which is why ruins feel eerie. They aren't haunted, they're unattended. As we look at the full arc, the Maya collapse feels less like a fall and more like a long exhale. The system inhaled complexity for centuries, then it let go. And that exhale wasn't synchronized. Different regions adapted at different speeds. Some cities lingered, some shifted early. Some tried to hold on longer than they should have, which is exactly what happens in any large system. There's no master switch, just gradients. Let's take a moment to think about time again. The Maya tracked time obsessively, but collapse operates on a different clock. It's measured in generations, not dates. A child born in 780 CE and one born in 830 CE lived in different worlds, not dramatically different, but noticeably. The second child inherited fewer monuments and more flexibility, and flexibility, in the long run, tends to win. By the time the classic Maya world had fully transitioned, the idea of divine kingship had lost its grip, not because it was disproven, but because it wasn't useful anymore. And usefulness is the quiet arbiter of belief. Ideas that help people survive stick around. Ideas that don't, well, they fade. Which is why Maya culture endured. It wasn't tied exclusively to stone or kings. It was embedded in daily life. Language, food, ritual. Those things travel well. Pyramids do not. As we drift toward the end of this part, it's worth sitting with one more gentle realization. The Maya collapse didn't erase beauty. It redistributed it. less concentrated in a single place, more spread across landscapes and communities, less spectacular, more durable. And history tends to remember spectacle more than durability, which is unfortunate, because durability is the real achievement. In the next part, we'll slow things down even further. We'll sit with the ruins themselves, what they tell us and what they don't, not as symbols of failure, but as leftovers of a system that once worked very well. So for now, rest. The path is narrow, the forest is quiet, and the stones are safe. All right, ease back in. Nothing new to do, just listening. By now, we've walked through the forests, the fields, the empty cities, and the long decisions that led people away from monumental life. So let's stop for a while. Not in motion, just standing. Standing in a Maya ruin. Stone steps worn smooth, plazas wide and quiet, trees growing where crowds once stood. And here's a thought that tends to surprise people. The ruins aren't tragic, they're neutral. They aren't evidence of failure, they're evidence of completion. These buildings did their job. They housed rituals, they projected power, they organized space and belief. And then the system that needed them changed, so the buildings were no longer needed. Which is exactly what happens to infrastructure all the time. We just don't usually let it sit for centuries and grow vines. When archaeologists first encountered Maya ruins, they were struck by the scale. How could a society capable of this just stop? But that question assumes that building big is the goal. It isn't. Living well is. And living well doesn't always require pyramids. In fact, pyramids are often a sign that a society has surplus to burn, literally. The Maya invested enormous labor into non-productive architecture. That's not criticism, that's context. Monuments are a luxury. They signal confidence, and confidence fades when resources tighten. The ruins mark the point where survival took priority over symbolism, and that's not sad, it's practical. Let's talk about abandonment for a moment. Abandonment sounds final, but in archaeology, abandonment often just means no longer maintained, and maintenance is expensive. Once a city stops being maintained, the jungle moves in fast. Roots crack stone. Moisture erodes mortar. Within decades, plazas look ancient. Within centuries, they look mythic, which tricks later observers into assuming catastrophe. But again, absence doesn't equal disaster. It often equals choice. The Maya didn't burn their cities. They didn't demolish them. They left them intact, which suggests they weren't angry, they weren't fleeing, they were transitioning. Many ruins show evidence of later reuse, stones repurposed, spaces adapted. People didn't fear these places, they just didn't center their lives around them anymore. And that's an important distinction. Now let's talk about memory, because the ruins stayed in the landscape, they weren't forgotten. Later Maya groups knew where they were. They incorporated them into stories, sacred places, ancient homes. Not lost worlds, just old ones. Modern obsession with ruins says more about us than about the Maya. We see emptiness and assume tragedy. We see silence and assume doom. But silence can also mean rest. The stones stopped working, so they stopped, and the jungle filled the gap, not maliciously, automatically. This is why ruins feel peaceful. They aren't sites of violence. They're sites of conclusion. The work was finished, and there's something deeply calming about that. Now let's gently zoom out again. The classic Maya world lasted centuries, longer than many modern states. Its end wasn't sudden. It was earned, in a way. Earned through overextension, yes, but also earned through extraordinary achievement. And when that system reached its limits, it didn't explode, it softened, it dispersed, and dispersion preserved people, which is the part that matters most. We tend to measure civilizations by their biggest structures, but structures don't live, people do. And the Maya people lived on. They adapted, they carried their knowledge forward. So when you stand in a ruin today, you're not standing in a graveyard, you're standing in an archive, one that tells a story without words, a story about how systems rise, peak, and let go. No moral, no warning label, just a record. As we drift toward the end of this part, it's worth noting how rare this kind of collapse actually is. A slow, non-violent, adaptive transition. No conquest, no annihilation, just change. And maybe that's why it feels unsatisfying to some. There's no villain, no final battle, just people making choices over generations, which is not exciting, but it's honest. In the next part, we'll move toward the very end of our long walk, not to conclude dramatically, just to sit with what remains, and what always remains. So for now, rest. The stones are cool, the air is thick, and nothing here is... All right, we're almost at the end of our very long walk now. Nothing to rush. No finish line to cross dramatically. Just one more stretch of slow thinking. By this point, the pyramids are behind us. The kings have faded into inscriptions. The cities have softened into landscape. So what's left? People. Always people. The most enduring thing about the Maya collapse is how little it disrupted Maya identity. Languages survived, still spoken today, dozens of them. Food traditions survived. Maize, beans, squash. Cosmology survived. Calendars, ritual cycles, sacred days. None of that required divine kings or massive cities. Those things lived at the household level, which is the most durable level there is. Empires live in capitals. Cultures live in kitchens. And the Maya collapse proved that distinction very clearly. When the political system unraveled, cultural practices didn't disappear. They downsized. They localized. They adapted, which is exactly what culture does best. This is where the idea of collapse really falls apart, because collapse suggests erasure, and erasure didn't happen. Transformation did. The classic Maya system, with its monumental focus, divine kingship, and intense urbanism, was one expression of Maya culture, not the whole thing. When that expression became unsustainable, it ended. Other expressions continued. Quietly, efficiently. Let's talk about memory again, just briefly, because memory doesn't live in stone as well as we like to think. Stone lasts. Memory moves. It moves with people, with language, with stories. That's why archaeologists find continuity in ceramics, farming methods, household layouts. The rhythm of daily life persisted, which means for most Maya descendants, there was no sense of living among the ruins of a fallen civilization. They were living among places their ancestors once built and no longer needed, which is very different emotionally. There's no grief attached to that, just awareness. Now here's a thought that's very easy to miss. The Maya collapse didn't teach the Maya anything dramatic. It didn't need to. They already knew how to adapt. The lesson was mostly for us. Modern societies look at ruins and see endings. The Maya saw transitions, and that difference matters because it reminds us that history doesn't belong to monuments. It belongs to continuity. One of the reasons the Maya collapse still fascinates people is because it refuses to be a cautionary tale with a clear moral. There's no single mistake to avoid, no lever that could have been pulled differently. The system worked until it didn't. Then it changed, which is unsettling because it means collapse isn't always preventable. Sometimes it's just the cost of growth. That doesn't mean it's meaningless. It means it's human. As we settle into the final moments of this script, it's worth letting go of the word collapse entirely. What happened to the classic Maya world wasn't collapse. It was release. Release from over-centralization, from rigid ideology, from monumental obligation. And release allowed survival, which is the most generous outcome history ever gives. So when you think of the Maya now, try not to picture a lost civilization swallowed by jungle. Picture families moving closer to water, communities reorganizing, traditions adapting. Picture continuity without spectacle. Because that's the real ending. And it's not dramatic. It's quiet, which makes it perfect for falling asleep to. So let's end here. No grand conclusion, no final warning, just the sound of insects, warm stone cooling under night air. History isn't over. It never is. It just keeps changing, slowly, patiently, while people keep living. And that's enough. All right. If you're still here, or half here, welcome back. This is the part after the ending, the part history books usually skip, the part where nothing new happens and everything continues anyway. Because even after the classic Maya world released itself, time didn't stop. It never does. It just lowers its voice. Long after the last stela was carved in the southern lowlands, Maya communities were still planting maize, still counting days, still telling stories that stretched backward farther than any pyramid ever could. Life didn't feel post-apocalyptic. It felt normal again. And that's important. Civilizations don't usually end with silence. They end with normalization. The post-classic Maya world settles into patterns that feel smaller, yes, but also steadier. Less stone, more trade, more movement. Cities rise and fall without pretending they're eternal, and that humility matters. Places like Mayapan emerge later, functioning with councils and shared power structures. Not perfect, still messy, still human, but noticeably less obsessed with divine kings bleeding to keep the sky intact, which suggests a collective memory at work, not written, not carved, felt. The land had limits. The old system crossed them. The new ones tried not to. That doesn't mean they always succeeded. History never offers perfection, but it does offer adjustment. Now, let's sit very gently with something else. When the Spanish eventually arrived, they didn't encounter a people wandering aimlessly among ruins. They encountered organized societies, markets, political rivalries, religious traditions. The Maya were still very much there. What shocked the Spanish wasn't absence, it was continuity. And yet, the old ruins fascinated them more than the living people, which tells us something uncomfortable about how humans relate to the past. We prefer dead grandeur to living complexity. Ruins are quiet, people are not, and quiet things feel easier to romanticize. But the real Maya story doesn't live in stone. It lives in persistence, It lives in language that survived conquest, in farming techniques still used, in calendars that kept counting days long after empires stopped caring. That's endurance. And endurance doesn't need monuments. Now, very softly, let's bring this back to us. Not as a warning, not as a lesson you're supposed to learn, just as a thought. The Maya collapse feels distant because of time and jungle and stone, but the pattern is close. Systems grow, they succeed, they harden. Then reality shifts, and people adapt faster than institutions. That's not doom, that's human behavior, and it's oddly reassuring, because it means that even when systems strain, people usually find ways forward, not dramatically, not heroically, quietly, by moving, by changing routines, by letting go of things that no longer help. The Maya didn't cling to a broken system out of loyalty. They valued survival over symbolism, and that's a kind of wisdom that doesn't get statues. As we finally let this story fade out, not end, just fade, it's worth noticing how calm it feels. No fire, no final battle, just forests growing, paths shifting, people living. History often looks loud from far away. Up close, it whispers, and that whisper is steady. So, if your eyes are heavy now, that's perfect. The Maya are still there. The jungle is still growing. Time is still moving, and nothing needs your attention anymore. Just let the story rest. All right, still here, still slow, still no urgency. This is the stretch of history that doesn't get a title, no era, no bold heading in a textbook, just continuation. After the classic collapse and the quieter post-classic adjustments, Maya life settles into something deeply unremarkable in the best possible way. Villages grow, villages shrink. Trade routes shift slightly east or west depending on water and politics. Nothing collapses, nothing explodes. And this is where modern brains struggle a little, because we're trained to look for peaks and endings. But most of history lives in plateaus. The Maya lowlands remain inhabited. People farm familiar plots. They build houses that don't aim to impress anyone except the rain. Leadership exists, but it's more negotiable now, less cosmic, more practical, which means leaders are easier to replace. And that's healthy. Power doesn't disappear after collapse. It just becomes less theatrical. Rulers still exist. They just don't carve their birthdays into stone anymore, which honestly saves a lot of time. Trade remains essential. Salt from the coasts is still incredibly valuable. Cacao still matters. Cotton still moves. Markets become more important than monuments, because markets respond faster than temples. Religion continues too, but it's lighter, not less meaningful, just less centralized. Household rituals matter more. Local priests matter more. Big cosmic performances fade. And that shift is subtle but crucial. When belief is embedded in daily life rather than state spectacle, it's harder to break, which is why Maya spirituality survives conquest, because it's woven into routine, not architecture. Now let's talk about something that rarely gets mentioned: memory without nostalgia. Later Maya communities didn't look at classic ruins and say, "We must return to this." They didn't attempt to rebuild the old system, which tells us something important. They didn't see it as a golden age lost. They saw it as a phase completed. That's a level of emotional maturity civilizations rarely get credit for. There was no political movement to restore divine kingship, no cult trying to resurrect old dynasties, no grand longing for the days of endless monument building. People remembered, and moved on. And that may be the healthiest response to systemic failure imaginable. The ruins existed, they were respected, sometimes ritually acknowledged, but they weren't goals, they were background, which is exactly what old systems should become. Now, very gently, let's think about what didn't survive. Certain artistic styles faded, certain dynastic names disappeared. The obsession with time recording in stone slowed. That kind of hyper-chronological thinking becomes less important when daily survival takes priority. And that's not cultural loss, that's reprioritization. History likes to frame this as decline because history is written by people who like records, but people living through it probably felt relief, less pressure, fewer obligations, more autonomy. Not easier lives, but more controllable ones, which is a trade many people are willing to make. As centuries pass, the classic period becomes ancient history, even to the Maya, not mythic, just old. Which is another detail worth lingering on. Civilizations don't remember themselves forever. Memory thins, and that thinning isn't tragedy, it's necessary. If every generation carried the full emotional weight of every previous one, nothing would move. Letting go is part of continuity, and the Maya did that well. Now, let's briefly touch on archaeology again, because archaeology has a bias toward collapse narratives. Broken things leave evidence, continuation doesn't. It's hard to study people who keep living. They don't leave dramatic layers, they leave subtle ones. So for a long time, the Maya collapse looked worse than it was, not because it was worse, but because adaptation is quiet. Archaeology is learning to listen to that quiet now, and the picture that emerges is not of failure, but of recalibration, which makes the Maya story feel oddly gentle compared to many others. No mass displacement by force, no total cultural erasure, just gradual change. As we drift further into this long aftermath, the Maya world becomes part of a broader Mesoamerican pattern, connected to others, influenced by trade and migration, not isolated. Never isolated really, which is another myth the ruins encourage. Isolation feels romantic, but the Maya were always connected, and connection helps survival. Now we're nearing the end of what most people would call the story, but history doesn't agree. History just keeps going. So in the next part, we'll take one final, very wide look, not at events, not at causes, just at what this long, quiet process tells us about humans when nobody's watching. No urgency, no lesson, just observation. For now, rest. The village paths are worn, the old cities are distant, and life is still. All right. One last slow drift. This part doesn't introduce anything new, it just lets everything settle. By now, the Maya story has lost all sharp edges. No dates pressing down, no rulers demanding attention, just people and time. And that's where civilizations are most honest, when they're no longer trying to impress anyone. The classic Maya world was loud in its own way. Tall temples, long inscriptions, kings announcing themselves to the future. It wanted to be remembered. The post-classic and later Maya worlds didn't seem to care as much. They weren't trying to speak to us, they were speaking to each other. And that difference is enormous, because when societies stop performing permanence, they often become more flexible, less fragile. The Maya, after the collapse, weren't weaker, they were lighter, less invested in maintaining appearances, less burdened by cosmic responsibility. They still believed the universe mattered, they just didn't think one man had to bleed on a pyramid to keep it running, which is progress. quiet progress, the kind that doesn't get credit. If you step back far enough, the Maya collapse stops looking like a fall and starts looking like a shedding excess, shedding rigidity, shedding systems that demanded too much for too little return. And shedding hurts at first, but it also frees movement. That's why Maya culture didn't fossilize. It stayed responsive, which is why it survived things far more destructive than drought or political instability. It survived conquest, forced conversion, disease. Because it wasn't locked into a single form, it had already learned how to change. And that lesson didn't come from textbooks or warnings. It came from experience. Now, very gently, let's think about why we're so drawn to collapse stories in the first place. Part of it is fear, part of it is fascination, but part of it is control. If collapse has a clear cause, we can believe we'll avoid it. If it's messy and gradual, that's harder. The Maya collapse is uncomfortable because it refuses to be neat. It doesn't give us a villain, no single drought, no single bad king, no one mistake, just complexity meeting limits, which is how most real things end, or change, or continue. So when we call it a collapse, we're really expressing disappointment. We wanted drama. The Maya gave us patience instead. They gave us a reminder that survival doesn't always look heroic. Sometimes it looks like moving to a smaller village, or planting fewer fields, or letting old cities rest. And that's not failure, that's adjustment. The ruins, then, are not symbols of doom, they're footprints, evidence of where people once needed to be and where they no longer did. As this very long, very quiet story finally releases you, there's nothing to carry forward. No warning, no advice, just a sense of scale. Civilizations are loud for a while, then they soften. People remain, always. So if you're drifting now, if your thoughts are slowing, that's perfect. History has done its job, not by teaching, but by accompanying you, slowly, gently, until there's nothing left to hold on to. Just, okay, still going, because history apparently never knows when to stop talking, and neither do we. By this point, the Maya collapse has dissolved into something almost unrecognizable. No drama, no turning point, just a long exhale stretched across centuries, which is exactly why it works so well as a bedtime story. Nothing is demanding your attention anymore. So, let's drift into the very last layer of this story, the layer that exists mostly in the present. Because the Maya collapse didn't end in the past. It ended yesterday, and the day before that, and tomorrow. Every time someone walks past a ruin without thinking much about it. Modern archaeology didn't always understand this. Early explorers arrived with notebooks full of assumptions. They wanted lost cities, vanished people, mystery. They got living communities instead, which was inconvenient. Because it's harder to romanticize a collapse when the descendants are right there, farming, speaking their languages, raising families. Ruins feel dramatic. Continuity feels awkward. So for a long time, the narrative focused on disappearance. The Maya vanished, people said. They did not. They relocated. They restructured. They adjusted their expectations of what a city should be, which is not the same thing. That misunderstanding says more about modern thinking than ancient reality. We like clean endings. The Maya gave us blur. Even today, when archaeologists map abandoned cities with LiDAR and drones, what they're really mapping is former density, not absence. They're seeing where people once gathered intensely and then chose not to anymore, which reframes everything. The jungle didn't swallow the cities. The cities were allowed to rest. Nature just moved in afterward, because nature always does, and honestly, it waited politely. Now, let's slow down even more. Imagine standing in one of those old plazas, not imagining crowds, not imagining ceremonies, just standing there. The stones are warm, the space is open. It's not haunted, it's neutral. That's what most ruins feel like in real life. Not tragic, not ominous, just finished. And that's how the classic Maya world ended, finished with what it was trying to do. It had reached the edge of its usefulness, and instead of dragging itself forward out of pride, it stopped, which is not something many systems manage. There's a kind of dignity in that. Now, here's a thought that's very easy to miss when we talk about a collapse. The Maya didn't know they were living through one. No one woke up and said, "Ah, yes, the collapse has begun." Life just became harder in certain places, so people made choices. Those choices accumulated, and eventually the old pattern wasn't the dominant one anymore. That's it. No announcement, no closing ceremony, just gradual redirection. Which is why this story feels so calm. There's no single moment to fixate on. And that calm is contagious. If you've made it this far, your brain has probably stopped trying to categorize everything. Good. That's the correct response. Because the Maya collapse doesn't want to be categorized. It wants to be observed. One more very gentle contrast before we fully let go. When modern societies face strain, they often respond by doubling down. More control, more extraction, more spectacle. The classic Maya did that too, for a while. More monuments, more rituals, more demands. And then they stopped. They didn't escalate forever. They let the system shrink, which may be the quietest form of intelligence history offers. Not brilliance, not innovation, restraint. And restraint never looks impressive in ruins, so it gets overlooked. But it's there, in the villages that survived, in the traditions that adapted, in the languages still spoken. Those are the real monuments. You can't photograph them as easily, but they last longer. As this story finally, truly winds down, there's nothing left to solve, no mystery to unlock. The Maya collapse isn't a puzzle, it's a process. And processes don't end. They slow, they change shape, they pass their momentum on. So if this feels less like a conclusion and more like fading music, that's intentional. History isn't bowing, it's stepping aside, letting you rest. The stones are still there, the people are still there, the jungle is still growing, and the story has simply stopped asking for attention, which is the kindest ending possible. So you don't need to remember anything. You don't need to take a lesson. Just let the timeline blur, let the voices soften, and let sleep do what civilizations eventually learn to do. All right, we're deep into the after now. The part where even historians start speaking more quietly. Not because there's nothing left, but because everything left is very, very gentle. At this stage, the Maya collapse has fully stopped behaving like an event. It's more like a background temperature. Always there, never dramatic. And that's exactly how it should be. Because when you zoom out far enough, civilizations don't end. They thin out. They loosen their grip. They stop insisting on being one thing. The Maya world did that slowly, almost politely. No rage against the dying of the monumental light, no last-ditch attempt to rebuild every pyramid, just a collective shrug and a shift in direction, which might be the most relatable thing about them. By the time we reach the centuries just before European contact, the classic world is no longer emotionally present. It's not mourned. It's not celebrated. It's background, like a childhood home you don't think about unless someone asks. The Maya people are living forward, not backward. They're navigating alliances, trading, arguing, farming, being human in extremely ordinary ways. And that ordinariness is the final insult to the collapse narrative. Because collapse stories want tragedy. They want regret. The Maya story gives us acceptance. And acceptance is deeply uncinematic, which is why it works so well at 2 a.m. Now, let's take one last slow walk through the ruins, but not as archaeologists, as neighbors. Imagine you live near one of these old cities. It's just there. Stones repurposed for walls, paths cutting through plazas, children playing where kings once posed for eternity. That's not desecration, that's integration. The ruins aren't sacred or cursed, they're useful. And usefulness is the final stage of legacy, when something stops needing explanation. That's where the Maya collapse ends, not in abandonment, but in familiarity. Over time, the ruins become part of the land becomes part of the story, and the story stops needing a narrator. Which is admittedly awkward for me, because this whole script has been about stretching the ending as long as possible. But history insists. Eventually, it stops offering new sentences. So instead, we let repetition take over. The same patterns, the same adaptations, the same quiet persistence, generation after generation. That's not stagnation, that's rhythm. And rhythm is soothing, it's predictable, it doesn't wake you up, which is why we're here. So if your thoughts are drifting now, looping slightly, that's perfect. You're syncing with the pace of the story. Nothing new is coming, nothing surprising is hiding. The Maya collapse had already done everything it's going to do. It changed shape, it released control, it allowed people to keep living, and then it stopped demanding to be noticed, which is the ultimate fate of all histories. They don't end, they become ambient, like wind through trees, like insects at night, like time itself. So we'll leave it here. No final statement, no closing moral, just the sense that something large has gently passed and left enough behind, enough language, enough memory, enough life. That's more than most civilizations manage, and it's more than enough for sleep. You don't have to hold on to anything now. History has already. Okay, if you're still listening, or sort of listening, or dreaming adjacent to listening, welcome to the deepest layer of the story. This is where nothing happens, and that's the point. The Maya collapse, by now, is no longer something you can point to on a timeline. It's dissolved into the background noise of human existence, and background noise is the most honest form of history. At this distance, the old questions don't really work anymore. Why did it happen? When did it happen? Those questions require edges. But what we're left with has no edges, just gradients. Cities thinning out, populations redistributing, power becoming negotiable instead of divine. No single generation experienced the end. Each generation just experienced change. a slightly shorter walk to water, a slightly smaller harvest, a leader with fewer ritual obligations. Small things. Always small things. And that's what actually reshapes the world. Not moments, patterns. From far enough away, the Maya world never collapses at all. It breathes in, and then out. Expansion, contraction, like lungs, like forests, like everything that stays alive long enough to learn moderation. The monuments we fixate on, the pyramids, the stelae, the plazas, those were symptoms of intensity, not sustainability. They were the civilization holding its breath, and eventually it had to exhale, which it did, slowly, without panic. Now, here's something that feels oddly comforting. The Maya didn't leave us a warning message carved into stone. No, don't do what we did. No moral carved in glyphs. They trusted future humans to figure things out on their own, which is either very wise or very tired, probably both. Because cultures don't exist to teach lessons, they exist to meet needs. And when needs change, cultures change with them. Or they don't survive. The Maya chose survival. Again and again. Even when survival meant being less impressive, less centralized, less visible. Which is the part we struggle with. We equate visibility with success. The Maya quietly disagreed. They faded from the skyline and stayed in the soil, in the language, in the calendar cycles still quietly ticking, in the way corn is planted. Those things don't announce themselves. They persist. And persistence doesn't need an audience. By the time modern scholars arrive, asking where everyone went, the answer is simple. Nowhere. They just stopped building things meant to last forever, because forever is exhausting. As we drift into the very end of this already overextended ending, the story becomes almost meditative. The jungle grows, the stones weather, people adapt, repeat. No urgency, no climax, just repetition smoothing everything out. Which is why this works as a sleep story, because sleep is repetition too. Breath in, breath out. Thoughts soften, edges blur, and eventually the need to understand fades. You don't need to hold the Maya collapse in your mind anymore. It's done being a topic. It's just a rhythm now. One more slow thought before we fully let go. Civilizations don't fail because they change. They fail when they refuse to. The Maya changed. That's the whole story. Everything else is decoration. So if this feels less like the end of a documentary and more like the sound of rain fading into silence, good. That means the story has stopped performing, and you can stop listening. Time will keep moving, the jungle will keep growing, people will keep adapting, and history will keep whispering until you don't hear it anymore. And that's all right. This is the part that technically shouldn't exist, and yet here it is. Because the Maya collapse never learned how to end politely, it just keeps thinning out, like mist at sunrise, still there, but not asking anything of you. By now, the story isn't really about the Maya anymore. It's about time. And time, as it turns out, is deeply uninvested in drama. It doesn't care which dynasty ruled, which city was tallest, which king had the longest name carved into stone. Time cares about rhythms, rain, soil, food, movement. And when those rhythms shift, people shift with them. That's all that ever happened here. The Maya collapse, stripped of all academic language, is just a long negotiation with reality. The land said, "This is how much I can give." The system replied, "We'll take more." For a while, that worked. Then it didn't. So the people adjusted, not with speeches, not with declarations, with feet, with choices, with silence. And silence is uncomfortable for historians. Silence doesn't leave citations, it leaves continuity, which we only notice when we stop expecting noise. That's why this story feels like it keeps dissolving the closer we get to the end. Because the closer you get to real human life, the less narratable it becomes. Nobody narrates planting corn for the 100th time. Nobody records deciding to move a house a little closer to water. Nobody carves a stela about choosing not to build a stela. And yet, those are the moments that mattered most. The Maya collapse isn't remembered by the people who lived through it. It's remembered by the people who came later and found the stones. And stones only tell part of the story. They tell us where attention once went. They don't tell us where it shifted. That part is quieter. Now let's slow down even more. Imagine night in the lowlands. No ceremony, no chanting crowds, just insects, firelight, voices inside houses. This is the world that outlived the pyramids. Not smaller, just closer. Closer to the ground, closer to necessity, closer to sustainability. And if that sounds less exciting, good. Excitement burns fast. This world did not. The Maya collapse didn't create a vacuum. It created space. Space for flexibility, for local decisions, for survival without spectacle. And space, historically, is where cultures breathe. As this part drifts onward, you might notice something strange. There's nothing left to add. No new insight will change the shape of this story, because it's already done the only thing it needed to do. It moved, and now it rests, which means you can too. If your thoughts are looping now, repeating phrases, blurring images, that's exactly where this story wanted to take you. Not toward understanding, toward release. So there's no final sentence here, no neat conclusion to tie everything together, just the sense that something large has settled into the background and no longer needs explanation. The Maya are still there. Time is still moving. The jungle is still growing. And history has gone quiet enough to let you. All right. At this point, we've gone so far past the ending that even the ending has stopped caring. This is the part where history is no longer a subject. It's just atmosphere. The Maya collapse, if we're still allowed to call it that, has fully dissolved into the ordinary flow of time. Not memorable, not dramatic, just present. Which is honestly how most human experience exists. No one living in the centuries after the classic period felt like they were standing in the shadow of something lost. They were standing in the sun, or the rain, or the shade of a tree that didn't care who built what nearby. They worried about food, family, neighbors. They didn't worry about legacies. Legacy is something other people worry about for you. And that might be the quiet genius of what happened. When the Maya stopped performing eternity, they freed themselves from having to impress the future. They didn't need to outlast time. They just needed to move with it. That choice, conscious or not, meant they didn't collapse the way we expect collapses to look. There's no cultural whiplash, no sudden rupture, just diffusion, like ink in water. At first, it's obvious something has changed. Then it becomes part of the whole. Now, here's something that feels almost unfair to point out. The classic Maya world only feels tragic because we're attached to its visibility, big cities, tall pyramids, written records. Those things feel important because they're easy to see. But the Maya didn't lose the things that actually matter to survival. They kept their relationship with the land, their agricultural knowledge, their languages. They lost excess. And excess always feels like loss until you realize how heavy it was. The cities were impressive. They were also demanding. They asked for labor, water, food, loyalty, belief, and eventually they asked for more than the system could comfortably give. So people stepped back, not in protest, not in despair, in practicality. That's not collapse, that's recalibration. And recalibration is boring, which makes it perfect for late-night listening. As we drift deeper into this long, quiet continuation, the Maya story starts to mirror every other long-lived culture. It stops being unique, which is actually its final transformation. It becomes human. There's no singular Maya ending because there was no singular Maya experience, just millions of small decisions made over generations. And those decisions didn't stack up into a dramatic finale, they stacked up into persistence. Now, let's slow down again. Imagine the soundscape: wind and leaves, footsteps on packed earth, distant voices. No announcer saying this is the end of an era, just life. History books love eras because they need structure. Real life doesn't. Real life just keeps stacking days. That's what Maya did. They stacked days, counted them, named them, and then kept going. Even the calendar obsession, the thing we associate so strongly with the classic Maya, never vanished. It just stopped being carved into stone for strangers. It stayed close, household-level knowledge, ritual memory. Time didn't stop mattering, it just stopped being announced, which is another quiet sign of maturity. Now, as we approach the outer edge of even this extended ending, there's a sense of stillness, not emptiness, stillness, the kind that happens when nothing needs your response. You're not being asked to judge, or learn, or fix anything. You're just being allowed to observe and then let go. So if your mind is drifting now, wandering slightly, that's exactly right. The story has done everything it needed to do. It introduced itself, it explained itself, it softened. Now it's just there, like a low hum you stop noticing. And that's the final state of all history. It doesn't disappear, it fades into familiarity. So we'll leave it like this. No conclusion, no summary, just the sense that something once loud has become gentle. And gentle things don't ask for attention, may just exist. And that's enough. You don't need to stay awake for this part. Nothing important will happen next. History has already gone to sleep. And you... Okay. This is the part where even I'm going to stop pretending something is about to occur, because it isn't. The Maya collapse has fully entered the realm of things that no longer require narration. It's background radiation now, always present, never urgent. And that's exactly where it belongs. If we zoom out one last time, so far out that dates stop mattering, you can barely see the classic period at all. Just a slight rise in intensity, a brief moment of architectural ambition, then a return to baseline, which is what most systems do when they've tested their limits. The Maya didn't disappear into myth. They didn't spiral into chaos. They didn't forget who they were. They simply stopped building the kinds of things that demand constant explanation. And once that happened, history lost its grip on them. Because history prefers spectacle. It prefers moments that can be boxed, labeled, and argued over. What it doesn't handle well is quiet competence, or long-term adjustment, or cultures that survive by becoming less impressive. The Maya mastered that. So well, in fact, that we spent centuries misunderstanding it. We stood in front of empty plazas and assumed absence. But absence wasn't the story. Redistribution was. People didn't vanish, they spread. They didn't forget, they streamlined. They didn't collapse, they loosened. And loosened systems don't leave clean edges behind. They leave gradients. Which is why this entire topic feels like it keeps slipping through your fingers the more you think about it. That's not confusion, that's accuracy. Now, very softly, let's acknowledge something else. The reason this makes such good sleep content is because the Maya collapse doesn't activate urgency. There's no villain to watch, no disaster to anticipate, no final moment to brace for, just a slow adjustment to reality, which mirrors what your own mind is doing right now. Thoughts slowing, attention drifting, edges softening. Nothing dramatic, just easing. That's the same pace the Maya world moved at when it stopped being classic. No one panicked, no one announced the end. Life simply reorganized itself around what still worked. And that's a profoundly calming thing to sit with, because it means not every ending is loud. Some endings are just quiet permission to move on. So this is where we stop adding words, not because the story is finished, but because it doesn't need us anymore. The jungle doesn't need narration to grow. The calendar doesn't need commentary to turn. People don't need monuments to keep living. Everything essential is already happening on its own, and that's the final state of this story. Ambient, unimposing, complete without closure. So if you're awake, you can let your thoughts drift. If you're asleep, that's even better. Nothing else is coming. No twist, no final insight, no conclusion. Just time continuing at the speed it always has. And that's where we'll leave it. Right here. All right. Somehow, we're still here. Which means the story is still doing that thing it does, refusing to end, but also refusing to wake you up. This is the part where history becomes cyclical, not in a dramatic everything repeats way, more like a soft loop. Because once the Maya collapse dissolves into background noise, it starts to resemble every other long human story that ever existed. People adapt, systems simplify, life continues, and then, eventually, new systems form. Not immediately, not intentionally, just gradually. In the centuries after the classic period faded, Maya communities continued experimenting. Different political arrangements, different trade networks, different balances between ritual and practicality. Nothing as intense as before, nothing as centralized. And that was the point. Intensity is expensive. It drains land, it drains people. So the new Maya world stayed lighter on its feet, which is why it lasted. Now, here's a small, oddly comforting realization. The Maya collapse didn't create a vacuum that needed filling. It created flexibility. And flexibility invites variation. That's why later Maya regions don't all look the same. Some lean into trade, some into local ritual centers, some into loose confederations. There's no one blueprint anymore, which is another sign of health. Uniformity looks powerful, but it's brittle. Diversity looks messy, but it absorbs shock. The classic Maya world was unified in appearance. The later Maya world was unified in practice. and practice outlasts image every time. As this loop continues, the old cities slowly lose their symbolic charge. They're not sacred centers, they're landmarks, reference points, places you pass by on the way to somewhere else, which is honestly the most peaceful fate any monument can hope for. Not worshipped, not feared, just there. Over time, stories about the old places thin out, not because people forget, because forgetting is efficient. Memory is expensive too. You don't carry more than you need, and the Maya carried what mattered. Calendars that tracked seasons, knowledge of soil, rituals that marked life stages. They didn't carry dynastic gossip. Kings fade fastest when they stop being useful, which is why the collapse feels almost king-shaped. The system that elevated individuals to cosmic necessity let go first. Everything else followed more slowly. And that slow following is the part that rarely makes it into documentaries, because it doesn't fit a narrative arc. It fits a lullaby. Now, if your mind is drifting, you might notice this feels repetitive. It is, on purpose, because repetition is how systems stabilize, and it's how sleep arrives. The Maya collapse, when stripped of interpretation, is repetitive too. Pressure builds, adaptation follows, stability returns. Then it happens again, somewhere else, in a different form. Not a lesson, a pattern. And patterns don't demand attention, they invite familiarity. As this part eases forward, there's nothing new to introduce. No new characters, no new theories, just the same soft truths looping gently. People are resilient, systems are temporary, culture adapts faster than power structures. That's it. Everything else is decoration. So if you're still listening, you don't need to hold on to any of this. The story has already repeated itself enough times to settle into your subconscious, like the sound of rain that doesn't change pitch, like a clock you stop hearing. The Maya collapse isn't something to remember, it's something to fade with. And that's what we're doing now. No ending, just continuation. Slower and quieter each time, until eventually you don't notice. All right, we've reached that soft, strange zone where even repetition feels like too much effort. This is the part where history stops narrating itself and just exists. By now, the Maya collapse isn't a thing that happened, it's a condition that settled in, like humidity, like a long season. No one marks the day it arrives, no one celebrates when it leaves. It's just there, shaping choices quietly. The Maya world, after all the adjustments, settles into something deeply ordinary. Not diminished, not triumphant, functional. And functional societies don't produce dramatic stories. They produce routine. Routine doesn't echo through ruins. It echoes through kitchens, through fields, through language passed down without ceremony. That's why the classic collapse feels so loud in hindsight. It's the last moment the system insisted on being noticed. After that, everything important went private. The grand plazas gave way to courtyards. State rituals gave way to household ones. Time was still sacred. It just didn't need a stone announcement anymore. And that shift, from public spectacle to private meaning, is the quiet hinge of the whole story. Because once meaning moves inward, it's much harder to erase. Which is why Maya identity survived conquest, disease, and forced reorganization. It had already detached itself from buildings. It lived in practice, and practice travels lightly. Now, very gently, consider this. The Maya collapse didn't leave behind a warning. It left behind an example of something rarer, a society learning when to stop. Not perfectly, Not all at once, but enough. Enough to survive, enough to adapt, enough to fade out of the spotlight and keep going anyway. That's not something most civilizations manage. Most cling. The Maya let go. And letting go doesn't leave ruins that explain themselves. It leaves silence. Which is why this story feels like it's dissolving as we tell it, because silence resists narration. As we drift further into this soft, unmarked continuation, even the word Maya starts to feel less like a label and more like a thread. Not one thing, many things. Places, languages, communities, all connected loosely, which is exactly how resilient systems look. Tight systems snap, loose ones flex. The classic period was tight. The aftermath was flexible. And flexibility doesn't announce itself, it just works. So if your thoughts are slowing now, looping gently, that's not boredom, that's alignment. You're matching the pace of a story that has nothing left to prove. No final insight is coming, no revelation is hiding just ahead, because the most honest ending already happened. The system stopped insisting. And once that happened, life took over, quietly, patiently, without narration. So we'll sit here a moment longer, not to conclude, just to let the quiet settle. The stones are still warm from the sun, the jungle keeps growing, people keep living, and history, having said everything it needed to say, has finally grown comfortable with being background noise. That's all. You don't need to follow anymore. Nothing will change if you drift. Nothing will be missed. The story has learned how to continue without. All right. Still here. Or at least, something is. This is the part where the story has thinned out so much that it barely casts a shadow anymore. Not because it ended, but because it no longer needs form. At this distance, the Maya collapse is indistinguishable from everyday human adjustment, which, honestly, is the most accurate place for it. The forests have grown and regrown so many times that they no longer remember which stones came first. Roots wrap around temples without judgment. Vines don't care about dynasties. Nature never treated the collapse as a tragedy. It treated it as a scheduling change. Rain still fell, soil still eroded, maize still grew when planted correctly. The land didn't punish the Maya, it simply responded. And people responded back. That back and forth, that quiet negotiation is the real engine of this entire story. Not kings, not calendars, not monuments, just feedback. The classic Maya world pushed the land hard. The land pushed back. The people adjusted. End of drama. No villain, no failure montage. Just recalibration. And recalibration is dull, which is why it's so soothing. By now, the idea of a collapse feels almost impolite, like calling someone's retirement a disaster. The classic system did its job. Then it stopped. It doesn't need to be mourned. It doesn't need to be revived. It just needs to be understood as temporary, which is something humans are very bad at accepting. We love the idea of permanence. The Maya flirted with it, built tall, carved deep, and then walked away. Not from their culture, not from their beliefs, just from the performance of eternity. And the moment they did that, history lost its grip on them, because history feeds on spectacle. Without spectacle, it gets bored. Which is why this part of the story feels like it's dissolving into mist. There's nothing for history to latch onto anymore. Just people living. And living doesn't need a narrator. As we slow even further, it's worth noticing how little emotional weight is left. No sadness, no triumph, just neutrality. That emotional flatness is not emptiness, it's resolution. The system resolved itself, not into something perfect, just into something workable. And workable systems don't shout, they hum, very quietly. So if your thoughts are drifting now, losing their grip on specifics, that's exactly right. Specifics aren't required anymore. Dates don't matter, names don't matter, only rhythm. Day follows night, rain follows dry season. People adapt. Repeat. That's the story. And it's been told enough times now that it doesn't need repeating again. So we'll let this part stretch just a little longer, not adding anything new, just allowing the quiet to deepen. No new images, no new ideas, just the sense of something large having settled into place. The Maya collapse isn't asking to be remembered, it's asking to be left alone. And we're finally doing that. Which means you can too. Nothing else is coming. Not really. Just the same soft continuation, growing quieter with every breath. That's all there is now. And that's more. All right. This really is the last one. Not because we've run out of things to say, but because the story has gently stopped asking to be spoken. At this point, the Maya collapse has fully slipped out of narrative time. There is no beginning left to return to, no middle to analyze, no ending to land on. Just continuity, which is quietly funny if you think about it. We started with towering cities, divine kings, stone calendars meant to outlast the sun itself, and we end with something much smaller. Breath, routine, people living day to day. No announcement, no epilogue carved in stone. The classic Maya world wanted permanence. What it achieved instead was something better. Survival without spectacle. And that's not a dramatic achievement. It doesn't glow, it doesn't echo, it just works. The ruins are still there, of course. They'll always be there. But they're no longer the center of the story. They're landmarks in a landscape that never stopped being lived in. Markers of where intensity once gathered, and where it no longer needed to. That's the final shape of this history. Not loss, not failure. Release. The system loosened its grip. People stepped out of the spotlight. Life continued at a human pace, which is slower than ambition, quieter than power, and far more durable. So if you're still awake, you don't need to remember any of this. And if you're already asleep, that's perfect. The story doesn't need witnesses anymore. The jungle keeps growing, languages keep being spoken, time keeps turning its soft, indifferent gears, and history, having finally said all it needed to say, steps back. No curtain call, no moral, just the low, steady hum of continuity. That's where the Maya collapse ends, not with silence, but with life happening quietly enough that no one feels the need to call it history at all. You can rest now. Nothing else. Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something very chill, very slow, very dim the lights and forget your own problems for a while. So grab a blanket, lower the brightness on your screen, let your phone slowly slip toward your chest as your eyes get heavy, and let's gently drift back, about 1,500 years, to a place that was hot, humid, loud with insects, and absolutely packed with people who thought bloodletting was a personality trait. Tonight, we're talking about the collapse of the Mayan civilization, which sounds dramatic, but in reality, it's less epic downfall and more long, awkward fade out where everyone quietly leaves the group chat. No meteors, no single apocalyptic war, just generations of stress, bad decisions, climate issues, and elite nonsense. So basically, history as usual. Now, first things first, the Maya didn't vanish. They didn't disappear into the jungle like a lost sock in the dryer. Millions of Maya peoples still exist today. Languages, traditions, communities, still very much alive. What collapsed was the classic Maya political system, the city-states, the divine kings, the stone monuments obsessively counting time like cosmic accountants. And honestly, they had it coming, but gently, sleepily. Let's ease into it. The Maya lived in what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. It's a region that looks lush and forgiving until you try to farm it for centuries without metal tools, draft animals, or rivers that behave nicely. The Maya world was divided into city-states, not an empire, no single emperor, just dozens of independent cities, each ruled by a king who insisted he was chosen by the gods. Of course he was. These kings weren't just politicians, they were cosmic middle managers. Their job was to keep the universe running, rain falling, crops growing, time continuing without glitching. If something went wrong, drought, famine, disease, that wasn't bad luck. That was your king messing up his sacred duties, which is a lot of pressure for one guy in a feathered headdress. The Maya loved writing things down, but only the flattering parts. Stone monuments called stelae recorded royal birthdays, victories, ceremonies, and bloodletting rituals. So much bloodletting. Kings and queens would pierce their tongues, ears, or other areas to spill blood as offerings to the gods, because obviously the gods were watching and saying, "Yes, excellent, please continue." Now, the classic Maya period, roughly 250 to 900 CE, was their golden age. Huge cities like Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, Copan, massive pyramids arising above the jungle canopy, astronomy precise enough to track Venus cycles better than most modern calendars, mathematics with zero before Europe figured that out. These people were not dumb. They were extremely smart, which somehow makes their collapse more awkward. Because the problem wasn't ignorance, it was scale. Too many people, too many elites, too many mouths, and not enough flexibility when things stopped working. By the late Classic period, Maya cities were crowded. Tens of thousands of people packed into urban centers surrounded by farmland. But here's the thing about the Maya lowlands. The soil is thin, really thin. You clear the forest, plant maize, and after a few years, the land gets tired. The Maya knew this. They used terraces, raised fields, reservoirs. They were clever. But clever only goes so far when population keeps climbing and rulers keep demanding more food, more monuments, more ceremonies, more everything. Because kings don't downsize. Kings double down. More temples, bigger pyramids, longer inscriptions listing increasingly pointless victories over neighboring cities that look exactly the same. And the wars, oh, the wars. Classic Maya warfare wasn't total destruction. It was ritualized, elite-focused, and obsessed with capturing noble prisoners. which sounds manageable until everyone is doing it constantly. By the 7th and 8th centuries, Maya cities were locked in endless cycles of rivalry, alliances, betrayals, revenge wars. Think medieval soap opera, but slower. And hey guys, tonight we're going to do something very chill, very slow, very dim the lights and forget your own problems for a while. So grab a blanket, lower the brightness on your screen, let your phone slowly slip toward your chest as your eyes get heavy, and let's gently drift back, about 1,500 years, to a place that was hot, humid, loud with insects, and absolutely packed with people who thought bloodletting was a personality trait. Tonight, we're talking about the collapse of the Mayan civilization, which sounds dramatic, but in reality, it's less epic downfall and more long, awkward fade out where everyone quietly leaves the group chat. No meteors, no single apocalyptic war, just generations of stress, bad decisions, climate issues, and elite nonsense. So basically, history as usual. Now, first things first, the Maya didn't vanish. They didn't disappear into the jungle like a lost sock in the dryer. Millions of Maya peoples still exist today. Languages, traditions, communities, still very much alive. What collapsed was the classic Maya political system, the city-states, the divine kings, the stone monuments obsessively counting time like cosmic accountants. And honestly, they had it coming. But gently, sleepily. Let's ease into it. The Maya lived in what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. It's a region that looks lush and forgiving until you try to farm it for centuries without metal tools, draft animals, or rivers that behave nicely. The Maya world was divided into city-states, not an empire, no single emperor, just dozens of independent cities, each ruled by a king who insisted he was chosen by the gods. Of course he was. These kings weren't just politicians, they were cosmic middle managers. Their job was to keep the universe running, rain falling, crops growing, time continuing without glitching. If something went wrong, drought, famine, disease, that wasn't bad luck. That was your king messing up his sacred duties, which is a lot of pressure for one guy in a feathered headdress. The Maya loved writing things down, but only the flattering parts. Stone monuments called stelae recorded royal birthdays, victories, ceremonies, and bloodletting rituals. So much bloodletting. Kings and queens would pierce their tongues, ears, or other areas to spill blood as offerings to the gods, because obviously the gods were watching and saying, "Yes, excellent, please continue." Now, the classic Maya period, roughly 250 to 900 CE, was their golden age. Huge cities like Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, Copan, massive pyramids arising above the jungle canopy, astronomy precise enough to track Venus cycles better than most modern calendars, mathematics with zero before Europe figured that out. These people were not dumb. They were extremely smart, which somehow makes their collapse more awkward. Because the problem wasn't ignorance, it was scale. Too many people, too many elites, too many mouths, and not enough flexibility when things stopped working. By the late Classic period, Maya cities were crowded. Tens of thousands of people packed into urban centers surrounded by farmland. But here's the thing about the Maya lowlands. The soil is thin, really thin. You clear the forest, plant maize, and after a few years, the land gets tired. The Maya knew this. They used terraces, raised fields, reservoirs. They were clever, but